thought I could start with a few quotes, because we got a little bit of grilling from various people as a result of that. I had a message from Richard a couple of days after we won the award saying, David, very good urbanist, but I'm terribly disappointed, and I was transported right back to my school reports. So, and it seems to me that Richard Rogers and the Academy and myself have always sort of been on the same side, and so we're always slightly worried that we were not speaking off the same sheet, as it were. We were much happier when we got the Brandon Lewis quote, to be honest, even though one likes to think you're influencing government policy. Certainly, when I'm out in the pub in Manchester, it was very useful to say that when we supposedly won an award from a right-wing think tank to say, well, no, Brandon Lewis didn't like it at all, so it's okay, I promise you. We were perpetuating the failed eco-towns of the previous administration and doing it in a way to top down, which would have been fine if it had been anything to do with what we'd written, which of course it wasn't. And so I like Paul Finch's response to that in particular. About so I thought. And I've realised I haven't spelled arms right today, as Stephen helpfully pointed out at the beginning. Thank you, Stephen. I mean, Nick and I sat down about this time last year when the Wolfson Prize competition was announced, and I think quite a few people in the Academy did as well. We had a show of hands at the Congress about how many people had put stuff in for the Wolfson Prize. And we started off by saying, surely this is what we're against. Garden cities are what we've been fighting against all this time. Should we really be going in for this? And I think the conclusion we came to was that actually we shouldn't, it's too important an issue to leave to the garden city lobby, as it were. But as urbanists, it's something that we should be engaging in, it's something we should be thinking about. And we should be thinking about how we extend cities, because we've spent a long time over the last 20 years or so talking about how to consolidate cities, how we should be building within cities and so on. But sometimes one needs to think about how cities expand. And we shouldn't leave that to the house builders, we shouldn't leave that to the people who are looking for low-density suburban development. As urbanists, we should be responding to that. And we started thinking about the original three magnets, because actually, when you go back to what Ebenezer was talking about, he talks about quite a few bad things to do with urban areas. If you look at the towns, the closing out of nature, the excessive hours, the array of army of unemployed and so on, but he actually also had even more bad things to say about the countryside. If you look at what he was saying, I mean, the countryside is a terrible place, as far as he was concerned. The garden city was meant to reform the countryside in as much as it was meant to reform the town. There was also lots of quite positive things he talked about in terms of what was happening in cities. He saw cities as a very positive thing. And you remember that the cities that he was responding to at the end of the 19th century weren't particularly pleasant places. They're not the same cities as we're responding to today. So he talks about town and country coming married, and out of this joyous union will spring hope and new life and civilization, which is, I think we all agree with that. And what seems to have happened since then in the town planning movement in the UK is that there's been this schism between people who believe in the one side of that marriage, the garden city side of the marriage, and people who believe in the town side of the marriage. And actually, it's not been a happy marriage. It's been a slightly fractious relationship. And actually, at various times, it's broken out into hostility. Now, as part of this, I was remembering, how many people remember the late Michael Breheny of the Town and Country Planning Association? And I found a paper that he'd written about centrists and decentralists. And it was actually quite surprising. I'd forgotten actually how virulent that debate was. And there was a real sense in parts of the debate that cities were terrible places, and we were terrible people who were trying to get people to live in them. And somehow it was inhuman to force people against their will to live in these degraded, overcrowded cities. And Michael Breheny saw it as being a sort of ideology which was being pushed by certain extremists. And I was delighted at one point when he called me a new Jacobite. I think we're all new Jacobites in the room, as in followers of Jane Jacobs. He was very critical of Jane Jacobs, and actually no one's critical of Jane Jacobs nowadays, but back in the day that was seen as and he lumped together in his paper Jane Jacobs and Le Corbusier, both as being centrists and both as being equally damned in terms of what they were suggesting. And you forget about all that sort of thing. Sorry, here's Jane Jacobs talking about garden cities, which is a fantastic quote, which we didn't put in our essay because we thought it would annoy them. Creation of self-sufficient small towns, really very nice towns, if you're docile and had no plans of your own, and didn't mind spending your life with others with no plans of their own. which is what Jane Jacobs thought about garden cities. And so we thought that probably sensible not to include that in the thing. So we're talking about greenfield developments, and when we think about greenfield developments, we think about housing estates, and this is greenfield developments. And it's always good to have a first line of the essay. And our first line was that this is an essay about building a new town, but the new town in question is Edinburgh New Town rather than Culminald. Because actually we're talking about building afresh, building onto green fields, but doing so in a way which beautifies the city that we're attaching the development to, as opposed to being something which you have to hide. When you talk to housing developers about their new schemes, it's all behind buffer zones, and it's all behind screening and so on, as if they're doing something shameful. And it seems to us that when we're building housing, when we're building neighbourhoods, we should be doing something we're going to be proud of, something which enhances and beautifies the cities that they're attached to. So the key issue that the reason that politicians are interested in this is housing numbers. This is a graph that was originally done by Sheffield University and has been quite widely used. I think quite a lot of the submissions to Wolfson included this graph, and Nick has used it on various things as well. It's housing output. And we need to provide about 200,000 homes a year, which is just halfway up this branch here. And since we stopped building council housing, essentially we haven't been doing that. We're currently building about 120,000 homes, but even at the height of the housing boom in the sort of 2006 period, we're only getting up just about to 200,000 homes. We don't provide enough homes compared to the need that we have. And the red graph is housing prices. And there is an interesting debate by people like Paul Cheshire about the link between restrictive planning, as he'd see it, and housing prices. And whilst that's not a clear relationship, there is clearly something that goes on. Restricting supply is going to affect price. And if you compare the prices in the UK to, this is another graph from The Economist, the blue one is house prices in Britain indexed to a 1975 base, and the green one at the bottom is house prices in Germany indexed to the same base. In real terms, house prices in Germany have not risen at all since 1975, whereas in Britain it's gone up by 2,000%. And you can start drawing relationships about what might be happening in the German economy compared to the UK economy, and so much of our wealth gets tied up in the places where we live. So we at URBED spent a long time in the 90s talking about brownfield development, and this is where Richard was cross with me, because the starting point has to be that we should be building the majority of our housing within brownfield land, and nothing we said in our Wolfson essay contradicted the fact that that's what we should be doing. There is a question about how much it should be. Now, we did some work for Friends of the Earth in the late 90s, where we proved that you could build 75% of all new homes within urban areas. And we measured the capacity of the urban areas, and we were then taken on by the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, as it then was, and we wrote the good practice guide for doing urban capacity assessments. Now, what has happened is that in 2008, we got to 81% of all housing built in urban areas. So actually, that figure was more than achieved. But what happened is the housing that would have been built on greenfields wasn't built in urban areas. What happened, it just didn't get built at all. And actually, what happened was that we started building lots of flats in urban areas. 41% of the housing built in that year were apartments. And we stopped building housing on greenfields. I mean, actually, only 2% of housing in full house was built in the greenbelt. Virtually none at all. So what's happened is that we've got to the point where we are building the majority of housing within brownfield land, but we are building, as a result, arguably, not sufficient housing. So we need to think about building on greenfields. That's not easy for an urbanist to say, but we do need to think about it, because actually, even if we accept 60% of housing goes in urban areas, 40% goes in greenfield, and we need to think about that as much as we think about the stuff that goes into cities, because the stuff on greenbelt is the stuff that we're going to mess up. It's the stuff that's going to be left without people thinking about it. Unlike what happens in Holland and Germany, and Nick has been taking people to see places like Freiburg, to the urban extensions in Holland, Scandinavia and so on. And we go around these places and we think, why on earth can't we do anything of that quality in these countries? And the reality is that we can't. We find it very difficult. It's not because we've got poorer designers. It's not because we don't know how to do it. It's essentially an economic issue. So the fundamental point that we were trying to make in the Wolfson Prize essay is that housing design is essentially an economic issue. Now, the reason for that is that a piece of land in the UK, around a town like, say, Uster, is worth £15,000 a hectare. That's what agricultural land, that's the average agricultural land value in the UK. If you give a planning permission for housing, the average housing value in the UK is £2.5 million a hectare. That's a 2,000% increase as a result of just giving it planning permission. Now, as Miles Gibson said when he launched the Wolfson Prize, he said, what's happened in this country is that we had a planning system designed in the late 40s, which was based upon a very radical notion of nationalising land value, land development rights. So basically we took people's land development rights off them as a country, and we paid them compensation. We paid £300 million to landowners in the late 40s to compensate them for the loss of those development rights. Now, every time we give planning permission to somebody, we're giving some of that value back. We are redistributing that value to the people that own the land. And we're doing so in lottery-winning proportions. If you own a farm on the edge of any part of Middle England, you are essentially winning the lottery if you get permission for a housing scheme. Now, I've spent my time since the war sitting in rooms full of planning consultants and professionals and barristers and planning officers and planning and councillors and so on. And what you realise is that there's a whole system, there's a whole world out there of planning consultants and barristers whose only job in the world is to unlock that value. They're very well paid, and they're very clever, and they are trying to undermine every local plan, every piece of evidence base the planning system's creating, just to try and unlock that value. Because if they can get a little niche, a little crack in the edifice of the local planning system, they can work their way into that, they can get a big crack and they can get permission, and everyone gets very, very rich. And it's completely distorting the way that we build housing in this country. It's essentially all about that value. No one talks about where the housing should be, or how it should be designed. That doesn't come into it at all. It's all about how do you get permission, and then once you've got permission, you can spend £2.5 million on the site per hectare. You throw up the cheapest stuff you can go, because that's all the money you've got left. Because you've spent so much on the land, you can't afford to invest in infrastructure, you can't afford to build decent quality homes, unlike the things that we go and see in Holland and Germany, where land value is capped at the point at which permission is given at existing use value plus compensation. That's the difference. I mean, that's, in a sense, that's the only thing you need to do to start unlocking quality. And unfortunately, the Lions Review, which started looking at this issue, pulled its punches at the last moment on land value capture. Didn't quite go there. The other thing we said was, again, a slightly sort of risky thing to say for competition about garden cities, which is that you can't build them. You simply can't build them from scratch. And this notion that you can build a new town in the countryside on its own, and you can use the value of the housing to generate all the things that a town needs, just simply doesn't work. You can build schools, sure, you can build the open spaces, you can build a few shops possibly, if you're lucky. You can't build a public transport system, and you can't build the things that a town needs that are in a city. You can't build the theatres and the art galleries and the proper shopping centre and the proper public transport system, or the mainline railway station that you need for any. Surely that, that's a prerequisite of any settlement that you've got. That you can't build that from scratch. And so we said one needed to, if you're going to build a garden city, you've got to grow it from the rootstock of an existing place, rather than as a fragile sapling which will take years to mature. And so you need to grow it from an existing place like Uster. I gave this presentation in Chester last week, and they spotted that that's Chester. Not Uster at all. And we said that there were 40 places, probably around 40 places in the UK, which were like Uster. And we said the big cities, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds and so on, can probably accommodate most of their urban growth within their own area. Interestingly, we've since been asked to look at the Sheffield City region by the council to see whether that is actually the case. London's a whole case to its point, in its point in terms of the pressure of growth there. But medium-sized, smaller cities population 200,000 or so, are the places where actually there is not the capacity to meet their housing needs. So somewhere like Ulster, for which you could read York or Oxford or places like that, or Cambridge, doesn't have within it the urban capacity to build anything like 60% of its housing on brownfield land. It simply doesn't, impossible. So these places either don't grow at all, or they grow into they grow outside their current urban area. Now what's happening at the moment is that the councils, through this incredibly complex process which isn't working, called the duty to cooperate, are trying to collaborate with all the other councils who don't want to have that housing at all. Thank you very much. And the housing is being smeared around every town and village outside the greenbelt, around all of these towns. It's making no sense whatsoever, and everyone's getting very upset about it. And what we're saying is, rather than do that, why don't you actually take a confident bite out of the greenbelt? Because the greenbelt around these places is the most sustainable place to build. So we took our city of Ulster, which those of you who are keen observers of these things will recognise as being York. Dave Caulfield, who used to be City Planning Officer of York, didn't recognise it. If you didn't, then don't feel too bad. It is upside down. It's upside down and twisted back to front. But it is York. All the figures that we quote in the report are the figures for York. And what we did was we said, why don't you look at expanding, doubling the size of this city of Ulster by adding a series of substantial urban extensions, confident bites out the greenbelt. And this diagram is based upon some simple geometry. The red circle is 10 kilometres from the centre of town, which is a 20-minute tram ride. So the idea that everything within that circle you can get into the town centre in 20 minutes maximum by tram. Most of the places obviously less than that. And each blue circle is 800 metres, which is a 10-minute maximum walk distance. And so the middle of every blue circle is a tram stop. For everybody, even the most suburban bits of housing on this, so they can walk to the tram stop in 10 minutes and can get to the town centre in 20. And so the idea is that is a system which can be served by public transport and which can serve the centre. The idea being then the stuff in between is then countryside actually is kept as green space for the city. And these things are designed in triangular things. And Tim, I think it's just gone, hasn't he? Tim told me in space syntax terms this isn't brilliant, to be honest. But actually they touch the settlement lightly, and so in other words, most people in the existing town do not lose their outlook in terms of the green fields around it. And we took that and we applied it to Ulster, and we showed how that might happen. And we developed the idea that we would take 6,000 hectares of land, and half of it would be open space and half of it would be developed. And so the prize question, which was the difficult one to be honest, was how do you make this popular? Which is really difficult. As soon as you start talking to people, as Nick did in terms of Nick and John organised a workshop in Oxfordshire talking to people around Oxford about this, and you realise it's going to be difficult to make this popular, but the key thing is the deal. And the deal is that we will take the pressure off all these towns and villages by putting it into this confident bite. So actually take it off the pressure that currently all those little sites which are being developed around these places are actually taken off and put into one confident place. And so you start talking to the people in those villages about that, the deal becomes something which is possibly doable. In terms of open space, you say that you will create a hectare open space for every hectare that's developed, and you'll make that publicly accessible open space for the community as a whole. You'll put the tram system in terms of the infrastructure. You'll look at retrofits of the existing housing stock as well as the new stock, and you'll invest in the existing town centre rather than trying to create a new one. We felt that was a possibility that you might get a deal out of that. We also suggest, contrary to what Brandon Lewis suggested, was that this is a bottom-up process. Towns and cities should be able to bid for this status of being a garden city rather than having it imposed upon them. A lot of the other entries and a number of the other shortlisted entries are all about how do you choose the site for the garden city. We say you can't do that. You've actually got the site's got to choose itself and then bid to be nominated, particularly if you're going to do it in an existing place. As soon as you start nominating places from Westminster, you end up putting the garden city where there's no one to object, which is by definition in the wrong place. If you go to an existing place, you have to be bottom up in terms of how it works. Wolfson was very keen on the idea of like a referendum, and to be honest, we said don't do it because you probably lose. This is not going to help anyone. A number of the entries did actually look at that in detail, about how how the referendum might work, and I almost got convinced actually that the way it was set out was that you might just about be able to win it. But in a sense, you need to have a degree of political confidence and bravery. And politicians, the local council hated that bit. No, don't like the idea of bravery. And as I said, people should bid for it. So I never show slides like this, but the key thing on this slide, does that work there? 6,000 hectares being bought for 200,000 a hectare, which is £1.1 billion in terms of how much it costs. When you've developed it, you end up with £6.2 billion worth of value, which means that your unearned increment is in there, £4.1 billion. So basically, the money that would have gone to the farmer that goes into the infrastructure is £4.1 billion. That's the unearned increment from a scheme of this size, which is about 80,000 homes, 70,000 homes, sorry. And that's what we spend it on. It covers all the schools, it covers all the roads, it covers the tram system, it covers the healthcare, it covers all the open space. And it just about breaks even. So Pete Redmond, who was our other author on this, who then cash flowed it, we had to do this without public subsidy. The whole point was you couldn't spend public subsidy on it. It just about works in terms of breaking even in the long term. And we did that without any uplift in value. So we didn't assume that house prices would rise or land values would rise over the course of the process, because we thought they've done quite enough of that already, and we shouldn't rely upon land value and house price uplift to make this work. We should make it work in today's prices. And if you can get that level of land value capture through the process, then you can do this. In terms of how we built it, this is a Dutch plot-based urbanism. A number of us have been to see this. We suggested that it be built without the use of house builders. And again, I've talked in rooms full of house builders who aren't necessarily keen on that as a suggestion. But the idea is that the Garden City Company doesn't build any houses at all. But all they do is lay out the land, get the consent, put the infrastructure in, and sell plots. And so they sell plots, and plots can either be built by individuals wishing to build their own home. It can be built by groups of people wishing to build a group development. It can be built by small-scale builders. I mean, this is essentially the process by which Mayfair or Bloomsbury was built when it was first laid out. So plot-based urbanism with a whole range of players. And then if barracks want to buy 100 or 200 plots, that's probably okay in the overall scheme of things, provided that the whole system is set out in advance. And so we then talked about how we would get from where we are now to where we want to be. And did this through the 7 ages of urbanism, starting with conception, obviously. And the feeling is that even though quite a few people argued that the Newtown Act is still a statute book and could be enacted without the need for legislation, our feeling was, and I think the general feeling is, that there is a need for a Newtown Act or a Garden City Act, what they call Garden City Act, in the new Parliament. And I think there's quite a lot of traction from various parties to do that. Not that they'll tell you this, of course, because particularly the Conservatives are very nervous, to say the least, about anything which talks about greenfields and so on. But the Lions Review came close to recommending a number of these things. It pulled its punches on land value capture, but actually a lot of the other stuff we talked about, it was thinking along the same lines. Osborne, we're told, is very sympathetic to this, and the Vista announcement. Vista sounds very like Uster, doesn't it? I mean, it's almost the same thing. And we're told that he is very sympathetic. Obviously, Pickles and Brandon Lewis are very unsympathetic to the whole thing. And clearly the Lib Dems are very keen on the idea of Garden City. So we suggested Garden City Act, places are asked to bid to have the Garden City status. There will be a need for a carrot there in terms of what they get when they bid, but also a stick. What will happen if they don't bid? They need to have the requirement to provide the homes in the long term. They need to have that requirement put on them. They have a 5-year supply requirement at the moment. They need a longer term requirement, so they need to plan for housing growth in their area. And that's unavoidable. But having got that requirement, then this becomes their solution. Bidding for this status becomes the way that they can deal with this. In terms of its birth, the foundation, Garden City Foundation, is set up. That has a land company which CPOs all the land. The only way we can see at the moment of actually capturing the land value is you compulsory purchase. The land you compulsory purchase, all 6,000 hectares, You give the landowners compensation, but you then take that into public ownership, and that's how you capture the value. You commission URBED to a master plan, or other master planners do obviously exist as well. You get planning permission, but the planning powers are then given to the foundation. So the foundation has planning powers to see that forward. You put the infrastructure in, you put the roads in, there's a road hierarchy there, and then you plotify it. That's a horrible word, I know. But you lay out the plots, and the different colours show different densities, and we've been criticised by quite a few people that our density is too low, and we know they're too low. But we didn't want to have that argument, oh, it's URBED, they've gone for urban densities, and that's how they can do this without taking a lot of land. We've actually got densities going from 20 a hectare, 30, 45 and 65 a hectare, but a lot of it is sort of what Ebenezer and Howard would recognise as garden city densities. And actually, if you're doing plot-based developments, you do end up with slightly lower densities. So we set out the densities, and then you sell the plots, and as I say, planning powers are with the foundation, so they can actually deal with all that going forward. One thing we do, the value of the plots includes the social housing requirements. So we're not asking anyone to provide social housing. What we're doing is we're taking that money off the plot value, giving it to housing associations and asking them to build houses, just like it used to be in the old days. So that housing associations get to build their own houses rather than being given the dregs of the private developments, as what happens at the moment. And then you roll it forward. The idea is being that everything has a ground rent. People pay ground rent. The ground rent is then used to manage the developments. That management is then democratically controlled by the residents of the development, so they elect their own committees to run the management company that then looks after common areas and provides other stuff as well. Again, very like Letchworth works in terms of the management of that. And then you get to the end of the process, 30, 40 years hence, you've doubled the size of the town, and the question then is what next? Which is a very good question, but it's actually a long way off. And the answer to that question is, that's up to the people of Ulster when you get to that point. And if Ulster wants to double again, then it turns into something which looks more like Nottingham. Maybe that's what it wants to do. If it doesn't want to double, maybe it intensifies what it's done, because this structure has within it the capacity to be intensified. Or maybe it says that actually that's as far as it goes, and it wants to draw a halt to development there. That, in a sense, is a question for future generations. What we've done in this respect is dealt with a sustainable solution for the foreseeable future. And everyone I've talked to this about, and I've done this to quite a few conferences now, always get to this point and go, that all makes sense, actually. But couldn't possibly do it in our case. Obviously, it's absolutely impossible, but it all makes perfect sense in theory. So, be interested to discuss about the extent to which this is just a fantastic theory, or whether it actually is something practical that could happen. Thank you.